A Guten Erev Shabbos. There is so much to prepare for Pesach and for the Seder, so much to prepare. Even if you're a guest at someone else's Seder, there's a level of anticipation, which can also present as anxiety, for all the things that have to be ready. The internet, and before the internet, Pesach cookbooks, and before cookbooks, our grandmothers' minds had checklists upon checklists of items, components, elements to the Seder and Passover in general that have to be organized. We joked on one of our Zooms this past week that Pesach anxiety is obligatory from the day after Purim onward. From Hanukkah onward, it's optional. Now, much love and appreciation to those who put in so much effort and energy to getting everything ready. The matzah, the wine, remembering where the Haggadahs are kept, getting the house Pesach ready, whatever that looks like in your house, and everyone's kitchen is a little bit different. Some have a little more tin foil here, some have a little more masking tape there. Really, there is so much to organize. The thought is, hopefully, that readying the kitchen and the fridge and the dining room will nudge us to ready ourselves too, to get our hearts and minds kosher lePesach. What might that even look like? Let's say you work through the checklist and you get all the groceries you need. Everything's ready for the Seder on Wednesday night. Are we ourselves ready? Are you ready for Pesach? And how would you know? Speaking of checklists, there's an old story about a fellow who had trouble organizing himself in the morning to get out the door to work on time. So a friend advised him, at the end of the day, just make a checklist for tomorrow morning. Just write down where everything is. So you just follow the checklist. It'll save you time. You'll be on time for work. So that night, before he went to sleep, this guy put his briefcase by the door. On the list, briefcase by the door, he wrote, overcoat and scarf in the closet. Wrote on the list, overcoat, scarf, closet. Suit and socks on the chair, shoes under the chair. On the list, wrote it down. And he didn't want to leave anything out, so he wrote, and I am in the bed. Next morning he woke up, he found his suit, he found his shirt and the shoes under the bed, coat in under the chair, the coat in the closet, his case next to the door. But when he got to the part of I am in the bed, he went to the bed and looked. Oh no, he said, I'm not in the bed. Where could I be? This is terrible. The most important item is lost, not where it's supposed to be. Where could I possibly be? And he was late to work with all the time he spent looking for himself. In some way, we all do that also. Everything else is in place, but where am I? As we take out all the Pesach dishes, and the Seder plate, and the Pesach glasses, and the cup for Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah's cup, we also have to make sure to get ourselves in place also, and not forget where we are. And it's hard. It's been a hard couple of years, a real challenge, and it's not back to normal, if normal was even what we wanted. It's heartbreaking a little bit, and here is where a brief but very important element of the Seder can comfort us and give us strength. King David wrote in Psalm 34, Karov Hashem lenishbere lev. God is close to the brokenhearted. And the Kotzker Rebbe took it up a level, and he said, there is nothing as complete as a broken heart. On Pesach, at the Seder, where we want everything to be right, when we want everything to be complete and whole, everything as it should be in our mind's eye, let's notice and reflect that at that very same Seder, we celebrate brokenness. Not only do we celebrate brokenness, we enact brokenness. We break things. Not only do we break things, we break them and use them. And we talk about them and learn from them. And you know what we do? We even make a blessing. We even make a bracha specifically on broken things. We're talking here about the quickest, the briefest step in the whole Seder. Yachatz takes longer to say than it takes to do. It certainly takes longer to explain and to understand than to do it. Yachatz is by far the quickest step in the Seder. If you blink, you might miss it. Kiddush you can't miss because you're holding a cup of wine. It's the first step. It's the call to order. Everyone's paying attention. No one's tired yet. No one ran out of steam. Kadesh. You make Kiddush. You drink a cup of wine. Then urchatz, we wash our hands. Good thing we've had some practice with that over the last 3 years. Dip a vegetable in salt water for karpas. It's something different, unusual, what's going on. So that gets plenty of attention. In a minute after that, we're going to say, halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. Someone asks the 4 questions, which is a big, big moment. It's the ballet recital. It's the piano recital of the Seder. The kids' moment in the spotlight, moment to shine, in which so much rehearsal has been invested. And from there, we're off. We tell the story for as long as anybody has energy and patience to do it. But right in between there, after karpas and before we start the magid, before the 4 questions, we take the middle matzah of the 3 and we break it in half. We break it. It's mathematically impossible to break it exactly in half. So the larger half we're going to set aside for the afikomen, and the smaller half stays in between the 2 whole matzahs. We're going to use it later. One year at his Seder, the Tzemach Tzedek observed one of the guests was carefully comparing the 2 halves of his yachatz matzah to figure out which one was the larger one. So he commented, when greatness has to be measured, it's really not greatness. A gadol was madarf im mesten is kein gadol nicht, he said. Rabbi Twersky notes a problem with greatness in our time, so he comments on yachatz and greatness and brokenness. And he says, sometimes the world is impoverished in leadership. Presidents, prime ministers, and kings do not demonstrate any outstanding leadership qualities. You have to figure out for yourself if that speaks to our times. Their superiority, Rabbi Twersky continues, if it exists at all, is measured in millimeters. In such instances, the common person is apt to be greater, because they meet the criteria for being a regular person, a mensch, whereas leaders fail to measure up. Rev Schlesinger from London writes that as so much of the evening, the Seder night, is to engage the children, yachatz is actually something that we do just like children. We break it. We're curious to find out what's inside. In fact, that's really our task for the whole evening, to discover the inner meaning of things, what's inside, maybe even have a look inside ourselves and see what's going on. The most common understanding of why we break the matzah is because the Torah calls it lechem oni, the bread of the poor, or the bread of affliction, which we find in Parshas Re'eh in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy. This could mean a number of things. One is, of course, that matzah is slave food. It's cheap, it's filling, it's long-lasting, it's what you feed the slaves. That's any matzah. Even more, a poor person, the word for that is ani in Hebrew, and a poor person is not used to getting a whole loaf, a whole pita, or even a whole matzah. They have to make do with crumbs or broken parts or half loaves, which is what we have here once we break the matzah. So why do the poor eat only broken rather than whole loaves? Simply put, they don't have enough money to buy a whole one. Some also explain that the poor only eat a part because they experience what's known as food insecurity. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. So whatever they get, they eat only a broken off part rather than the whole thing all at one time. Maybe leaving a little bit of leftovers for some more difficult times. Who knows what's going to happen later, says Reb Chai Gaon. We read in Viktor Frankl in recent months how people in the camps would keep a little crumb or a little piece of bread, something in their pockets, to have for later, Nebuch. The Tur, the Beis Yosef, some of our codifiers of rabbinic law, explained that we put some of the matzah aside so we don't eat the afikomen before it's the right time. Another meaning is that a poor person wants to prolong his meal as long as possible. So we take a cue from that, and we prolong the mitzvah of eating matzah until the end of the Seder. The Gemara, the Talmud, in Tractate Pesachim interprets the phrase lechem oni, which we said is a poor person's bread, simply put. The Gemara says, lechem she'onim alav devarim harbe, bread over which you answer many things or speak about many things. And the fact of the matter is, we're going to have this broken bread in front of us the whole time we're telling the whole story of the Exodus, which is prompted by the 4 questions coming up right after we break the matzah. There is a source, by the way, for breaking the afikomen into 5 pieces at Yachatz. According to the mystical thinkers, the 3 matzahs on our table are said to correspond to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the middle one is Yitzchak Avinu, Isaac, who represents the aspect, the midah, the trait of gevura, strength, severity. there are 5 severities which are sweetened and balanced by 5 chasadim, 5 kindnesses. We touched on this in connection with when we bang the aravos, the willows on the ground at Hoshana Rabbah time, about a half a year ago. So for that reason, some people break the matzah, the afikomen, into 5 parts before they put it away. And not to wander too far down the afikomen path, but it does have to do with Isaac and his son Jacob, Yaakov, the 3rd matzah. This year, in our daily halacha review after Shacharis, we spent a day or two reflecting on the propriety of allowing, even encouraging, kids to take the afikomen and ransom it. Is that a good educational tool? Is that good chinuch? We asked. So Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer explains why it is. What's the one place in Torah where you see that trickery, deceit was employed? Give yourself a moment. Remember, Rebecca encouraging Yaakov to dress up like his brother Esav, to quote-unquote steal the brachas, the blessings from Isaac. They say not only that this incident transpired on the night of the 15th of Nisan, which would become the Seder night, the first night of Passover. So the 2 goats that Yaakov brought for his father were a foreshadowing of the 2 offerings, Korban Pesach, Korban Chagiga, for which we have 2 cooked foods on our Seder plate. Even more, where Yitzchak says to Esav that your brother came with cleverness and took your blessing. Remember that? Ba achicha b'mirma v'yikach birchasecha. For the maths fans, we note that b'mirma, the word in the Torah for with cleverness, is the same gematria as afikomen. So one of the Mefarshei Agada, one of the commentators, says that we're trying to summon those powers again on the night of the Seder. We're reaching for things that we may not yet be ready for, but of which we're nonetheless desirous. Nice. So we have to make sure that we have some lechem oni, some poor man's bread on our table, especially when we're telling the story of how we ourselves were slaves and then became free. Now, whenever we have a holiday meal, Shabbos, Yom Tov, we have to have 2 challahs, 2 loaves on the table to recall the double portion of manna, of man, that we got on Fridays, or Erev Yom Tov. Some say that at the Seder, some, means the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and the Rambam, they say we should always start with 2 matzahs, just like any other holiday meal. And after Yachatz, when you break one and put a half away for Afikomen, you're left with 1.5. That's what you're left with. Rashi and Tosafos say what's for us common practice, start with 3 matzahs. Then at Yachatz, when you break the middle one, that leaves 2 whole ones and a half. You need 2 whole ones for Lechem Mishnah, for the double portion of manna. And Lechem Oni, the idea of brokenness and poverty that we're discussing, is expressed by the broken matzah in the middle, and not expressed by the decrease in number, like the Rif and the Rambam. They seem to not require Lechem Mishnah, 2 whole matzahs at the Seder. And in fact, Yemenite Jews and those who follow the Vilna Gaon use 2 matzahs. So at Yachatz, we break the middle one. We leave the smaller half where it is, between the upper and the lower matzah. And we set aside the larger piece for Afikomen at the end of the meal. Most people wrap the Afikomen, the larger half of the Yachatz, in a cloth or a napkin, because the Torah reminds us that when we went out of Egypt, we wrapped the leftover dough in our garments. Misharaisam tsururais bisimloisam, it says. Some people have a custom to put it on their shoulders, because that same verse says, al shichmam, that we carried it on our shoulders. Now, if we need a half a piece of matzah, why break the matzah why not just do it at the beginning, in the afternoon, when we're setting the table? Why should we do it now, at this point in the Seder? The Kolbo says we do it at this point in the Seder because it's right before halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, so that we can say, this is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of poverty. We'll feel the distress that our ancestors felt in Egypt. It works out that we will recite the Haggadah, we'll say the course of the Seder over bread that's appropriate for a poor person who is used to having a broken matzah rather than a whole one. And why are we setting aside the larger piece? Some say it's because you need 2 measures of matzah for the afikomen, so that's why. But there's much more to the story, as there always is, once we start asking questions. The Chizkuni is a commentary by Rabbi Yecheskel ben Manoach, who lived in France in the late 1200s, he explains that the broken matzah of Yachatz is also a commemoration of how we kept Pesach while we were still in Egypt. Ki garshu Mitzrayim, says the verse. The Egyptians had been expelling us from their homes while we were still there, before the actual Exodus. Pesach, at that time, was a one-day observance of eating broken bread because we were chased out by the Egyptians before we were actually released from Egypt itself. Mareches Heidenheim, a commentary from about 125 years or so ago by a Rabbi Bondi from Frankfurt in Germany, says that the matzah is broken approximately in half to symbolize the limits of human ability and the greatness of God in contrast. The 10th plague happened about midnight, kachatzos, says the Torah, about the halfway point in the night. Also, Yachatz suggests the splitting of the sea, the Yam Suf. Also, the time we were supposed to be enslaved was itself broken in half. It was supposed to be 400 years, in comparison with the time of actual enslavement, which was 210 years. Also, Yachatz from Mechze, right, from a half. Chetzio Lashem, Chetzio Lo. The way we're supposed to celebrate Yom Tif is half for us and half for Hashem, as Rabbi Yoshua says in the Gemara in Psachim, Daf Samaches Amud Aleph. By the way, long before we even get to Egypt, or before we become slaves, or go free, or have a mitzvah to tell our children, we have the idea of Yachatz way back in Genesis, in Parshas Vayishlach. Yaakov is nervous about his brother Esav approaching, so he divides the people who are with him into two camps. Vayachatz es ha'am asher itai, Torah says. More on that later. The Pe'er Aharon mentions yet an earlier symbolism, even earlier in the book of Genesis. In chapter 15, God asks Abraham to be part of the covenant of the parts. It's called Bris ben Habesarim. Abraham takes 3 cows and 3 goats, splits them in half, and walks between them, which concretizes this covenant. 3 matzahs represent the 3 of each animal, and of course, the breaking in half at Yachatz is the halving of these offerings. Reb Mendel of Rimanov comments that when lovers part, take their leave of each other for whatever reason it is, for whatever time, sometimes they'll split an item in 2, and they each take half to remind them of their yearning to be together again. Once upon a time, like in the 70s, couples would wear a necklace with 2 halves of a heart, right, divided in half, or 2 halves of a coin. Anybody remember that? Reb Mendel says that that goes for our connection with God as well as our connection with other Jews. We should look at ourselves as half a matzah and recognize that we aren't whole until we join together with another Jew. Rav Shimon Schwab explained the moment of Yachatz in the name of his father, Leopold Schwab. Yachatz brings together Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, this world and the next world of redemption. There's no other night where we do so many mitzvahs specifically at night, eating matzah, drinking 4 cups of wine or grape juice, telling the story, eating maror. Most of the other mitzvahs, if you think about it, are exclusively during the day. Shofar, Torah reading, lulav and esrog. But all the mitzvahs during the night teach us that when things seem dark as night, that's precisely when redemption can come. The darkness of exile that we're currently experiencing is temporary. It can and will soon be transformed into the light of day and deliverance. Rav Sternbuch in Sefer Moedim Uzmanim explains that the matzah should be uncovered when we answer over it, when we tell the story that is Magid, that's the largest portion of the Seder. He says that it's specifically the broken matzah that we're answering over, so he suggests to take the middle matzah and put it on top of the stack. But he says that none of the other commentators agree with this. Those who disagree with this view explain that the middle matzah will ultimately have the upper hand when it is used to fulfill the actual mitzvah, when we hold on to it at the moment we're saying the blessing, al achilas matzah. So it should stay in its place in the middle for now, humble and broken, until it's called upon for great things, just as the Jewish people are and ultimately will be celebrated for what we are, not for any attempt to put ourselves over any other people. Orchos Chaim of the Rosh mentions yet another explanation for the breaking of the matzah at Yachatz. It's a reminder of the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf. Rav Rimon from Gush says that this means that over the course of the Seder we will attempt to shake off our enslavement. What enslavement? Our enslavement to the superficial, to the material, to escape our base desires. Over the course of the night, we reenact a process of redemption and purification, a process in which our souls will ultimately become true to themselves and true to their Creator. To us, Yachatz symbolizes the beginning of our path on this night and our ultimate goal, the transition from slavery and impoverishment to freedom. From Yachatz to Afikomen, we will progress stage by stage until we succeed in emerging as a free people. The late Rabbi Milevsky, who was a Rav here in town, as was his son in recent years, explains that the Afikomen that we're setting aside from Yachatz, when we break at the Yachatz, is derived from the Greek word epikumen, right? Meaning a food that's eaten for pleasure, something enjoyable, even sweet, that you eat for enjoyment. It's the crowning touch of a meal, he writes. Some hide the Afikomen, as we know. He says that some of the matzah should be eaten with appetite, and some of the matzah should be eaten without appetite. If matzah encapsulates our relationship with God, then of course there is a certain yearning that should be there in order for the relationship to take hold from our end, to broaden and deepen ourselves. That's lechem oni, the bread of poverty and want. And there is some of that connection, that relationship that we accept even without appetite or without longing or yearning, hunger. That's afikomen. Yachatz is the moment when these two impulses are understood as coming from the same source, although they do diverge. Furthermore, he says, our engaging in mitzvahs out of hunger can lead us to engaging in mitzvahs not for the sake of hunger, not for our own benefit, but for the sake of the mitzvah itself. That's called lishma, for its own sake. To underscore this point, he mentions both a Pirkei Avos and a Baal Shem Tov story. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos is from chapter 1, which we're going to read in a few weeks, on the Shabbos after Pesach. And it says there, do not be like servants who serve their master in order to get a reward. Rather, strive to be like servants who serve their master not to receive a reward. In other words, mitzvahs do earn you some merit, but ultimately that's not the point. The point is the mitzvah itself, the connection that it establishes and strengthens with God. When ulterior motives are present, they might detract from its value. This is part of why the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, comes at the end of the meal and not the beginning. It's not the hunger that should drive us, it's the desire to connect, which is a higher level. He illustrates the point with a story about the Baal Shem Tov. Each year they would send a messenger to Italy to buy the Baal Shem Tov an esrog. But one year there was a drought or something that diminished the esrog harvest. It was very hard to find. The messenger was gone a lot longer than usual. So they sent a second guy after him. This guy, they gave instructions, get a hold of an esrog at any cost. This is not the movie Ushpizn, it's real life, even more interesting than in the movies. So the second messenger found a guy with a beautiful esrog, but the guy was not willing to sell. He said, I don't attach a price to mitzvahs. I'm not selling. The envoy offered him a small fortune. No sale. He tried to pressure the guy. He tried to guilt him into it. Finally, the guy came to him one morning at Shul and said, I'm willing to sell the esrog. The messenger, of course, was delighted. He said, okay, name your price. The guy said, I don't want any money. What I want is the merit in Gan Eden of the tzaddik, this tzaddik, fulfilling this mitzvah. The messenger had to think for a minute. He wasn't sure if he had the authorization to make a deal like that. And then, just as suddenly, he remembered his instructions, get a hold of an esrog at any cost. Surely the Baal Shem Tov couldn't have been only talking about cash value. So he agreed, took the esrog, made the deal, got back home, and he presented the Baal Shem Tov with this beautiful esrog. And with a good amount of anxiety, he explained the price, what it was going to cost. That on the Baal Shem Tov's behalf, the messenger had bargained that all the merit for doing the mitzvah would accrue in Gan Eden to the guy who sold the esrog. What do you think happened? Any guess? Far from being upset, the tzaddik was overjoyed. He cried tears of happiness. He embraced the messenger. He danced with him in joy. And when he calmed down, he explained to him, all my life, I have wanted to do a mitzvah purely l'shem shamayim, purely for the sake of heaven, just because of its own sake, because God asks me, and not because of my own reward, my own self-interest. I've never succeeded, because in the back of my mind, I always knew how important a mitzvah was. I couldn't shake the thought that I was going to get something out of it. Now that you've made this deal, which I authorized you to do, so it's surely valid, I can do the mitzvah of lulav and esrog with complete confidence that I'm getting no reward at all. I'm only doing it because God asks me to do it. The Korban Pesach, which we don't have at the moment, but which we'll either have soon, or we'll certainly think of when we eat the other half of the yachatz at the end of the meal as afikomen, or maybe both. This represents the selfless devotion to the mitzvah. Not because we're hungry, but because we're mature, we're evolved enough to realize that even when we're satisfied, we can and we ought to connect with God through a mitzvah. That's not only a contrast to lechem oni, the poor man's bread we eat, which is one result of yachatz, out of hunger, but it's a goal we aspire to get ourselves to a place of freedom, which afikomen represents. It's the larger half. It's the better part. Rav Kook emphasizes this, that the smaller portion that we're breaking and we're going to eat for the mitzvah of eating matzah is eaten for appetite. It's from a place of hunger, in contrast to the afikomen at the end of the meal, once we're already full. He explains that these represent two stages in spiritual development. The spiritual novice, the noob, as my kids say, devours his meal with gusto, ravenously. The initiate, the veteran who's been around the block a few times, has conquered the cravings of desire and eats, although he's already satisfied. The quest ideally is not out of necessity or hunger, but rather to broaden and enlarge one's spiritual outlook and consciousness. Our goal in the course of the Seder is to reach that level of afikomen eating, food for thought, let's call it, a kind of spiritual nourishment that's beyond just the physical. And yet, at the same time, the fully developed spiritual person should not and must not disdain those who are not in the same headspace, on the same frequency. Sometimes even a spiritual person themselves is not at such a level of attunement. So with two halves of the matzah, we note the interplay between two types of consumption and absorption, a more basic level and a more advanced level. One is predicated on the other. And the fact that we find a place to celebrate both means that both the ends and the means are important. We cannot forget any of the stages along our journey, which is really the whole point of the Seder, is it not? This is also a reason for not just breaking the matzah before the Seder starts and setting the table with the broken matzah. We put a whole matzah there, and then we make a show, we make a point. We give it a name, a step in the Seder of breaking it in half to show ourselves that the two parts are really one. They're really part and parcel of each other. We sanctify and celebrate both the journey and the destination, the ends and the means. Both are important and both are essential. We can't do without either of them. In an even broader sense, says Rav Kook, look at the discussion in the Gemara and Psachim about the trajectory of telling the story at the Seder. We're supposed to start with the low point of our history and end with praise. Rav in the Gemara says that means we should remember that our ancestors worshipped idols. Shmuel says it means we should remember that our ancestors used to be slaves. Now, why get into all the dark chapters of our history? Why not just celebrate the heights, the good stuff that came later on? Because our past experience actually comes into service. It has a use, it has its place in our present state. The fact that we knew how to worship, even though it was worshiping the wrong thing, helps us when we realize that it's actually God that we should be serving, worshiping, praying to. And the fact that we were once slaves ingrained a certain habit of obedience into us, that sense of obligation and connection, of duty and service, served us in good stead when it came to Mount Sinai. Na'aseh v'nishma, the acceptance of the yoke of divine service. For Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, matzah represents our great awareness of God. We ate it on the night of redemption from Egypt. We took it with us out on the way out of Egypt to sustain us until the manna arrived. So if this bread represents awareness, breaking that matzah is a sign of unawareness. At Yachatz, when we break the matzah in two, says Rabbi Nachman, we break our sense that we know God at all. We realize what's beyond us, and we separate our awareness into parts. The smaller part is what we know now. The greater part is what we will come to know in the future, in the time when even more than what's within our grasp now comes to our consciousness. And upon this bread of poverty, this lechem oni, bread of brokenness and affliction and unawareness, we're going to engage with the questions of the Haggadah, take ourselves to a place of greater understanding and greater and deeper connection. The Sfas Emes also connects the putting aside of the larger half for later as an affirmation of faith that the wonders that we'll see in times to come exceed even those which we've seen up until now. By combining the feeling of lacking now with hope of better things to come in the future times, Yachatz impresses that point on us. Even a person who's enslaved or lives in great poverty carries the hope and the dream of what it will be like when the day comes and the situation changes for the better. Even before we begin telling the story of our impoverishment and captivity, we're already looking ahead to better times. The Gaon of Vilna notes that the Jews leaving Egypt met all four qualifications of someone who's obligated to give thanks, according to the Mishnah in Moed Katan. We had been released from captivity, we had traveled overseas, we had been healed from our physical ailments and travails, and we had been through the wilderness. How much more so were we and are we on this special night in a position to give thanks and praise? The Kotzker would tell his followers that we must work hard to understand and connect to the words of the story of the Exodus in the Haggadah, like a Talmudic student would work and labor over the questions and answers of a Tosfos, because in the words of the Haggadah are the seeds of every subsequent exile and redemption. Therefore, says the Sfas Emes, both pieces, the bread of affliction and the bread of freedom, have to come from the same piece of matzah. A Gemara some of us learned in Tractate Brachas a few years ago on page 12a wonders whether the miracles of the Exodus from Egypt will be forgotten in future times because they'll be so far outshone by the wonders of the Messianic era. The answer given there is that they will not be forgotten, although the wonders of the redemption will be even greater. So the Sfas Emes explains this is precisely why the smaller half of our middle matzah is the centerpiece of telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, while the larger piece is what we look forward to at the end. It may be hidden now, but it will be revealed. In other words, taken out from its hiding place at the end, at the time of the final redemption. Of course, Reb Shlomo Carlebach delights in the fact that it's the children at the Seder who find and reveal the piece of matzah that goes with the final redemption, the Messianic era, the Afikomen. That suggests, of course, that children are our future, and also that in children we can find the secret of our redemption. Much of these insights into Yachatz and the two halves of the matzah refer to aspirations, recognition of our limitations, and using that as a way to aim for spiritual height and profundity. In fairness, we also have to focus on the simple meaning of brokenness at the Seder and give it its due. Recognize its place in the order of creation and in our lives. Rambam notes that the other holidays celebrate events that were completed. Revelation at Sinai, we celebrate on Shavuot. God protecting us in the desert, we commemorate on Sukkot. All opinions agree that the redemption, freedom, is not yet complete. It's still broken. The process began then with liberation from Egypt. It's still going on. Since then, we've had alternating periods of autonomy and independence on one hand, exile and servitude on the other. We're looking forward to a time when the process is complete. But since it's not there yet, we use a broken matzah to connect the incompleteness we feel now to the shleimut, the wholeness of times yet ahead. Rabbi Mann is part of Rabbi Torchiner's kollel here in Toronto, and he wrote an interesting essay on Yachatz in the Pesach Seder Companion that's available here in the shul. He writes in the name of Rav Y.Y. Jacobson, an old friend from Yeshiva, in the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Seder night is a night of the family being together, telling the story, and reliving the experience of going from slavery to freedom. However, as we look around the table, we see that many of our children, many children of the Jewish people, are missing. They're simply not present at the table. They're that fifth son, the one who doesn't have an interest or knowledge enough even to show up at the Seder. In fact, if we think about it, more are missing than are present. Not just our children, our other loved ones of the generations that we spent the Seder with in years past are not physically at the table. We think of this as we break the matzah in half, and we tell the story in the presence of the smaller half of the matzah, the smaller remnant of our people that is still with us, gathered around the table on the Seder night. The larger half representing the larger number of us who have not yet returned home. That is the half to set aside for times to come. An ani, a poor person, as we said, eats broken bread rather than enjoying a full loaf. Moreover, writes Reb Shmuel of Sachachav, he realizes he himself only has a part of what he needs, and he goes in search of completion, shleimus. Still more, God's way is specifically to make use of vessels that are broken. God hears the cry of the poor and helps them find the wholeness that they're looking for. So it is with anyone who lifts their eyes up to Shemayim and asks for help, as we all were when we were captives in Egypt. In the natural order of things, it seemed, we had no possibility of salvation according to the natural order of things. So our eyes were turned only to God. We remind ourselves of this with a broken matzah, that we are incomplete and we're compelled to look beyond ourselves, out of ourselves for what we need, similar to other reminders that we're incomplete when we stand alone and must look to others, to the community and to God, like the half shekel we give in Adar, or the Sanhedrin sitting in a semicircle or a crescent shape so that each one could see the other. Reb David Bornstein was the son of Reb Shmuel. He died in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. He wrote that when we see Yachatz, this moment of breaking the matzah in half, we're reminded of when Yaakov divided his camp in two, like we said way back at the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, chapter 32 of Genesis. Yaakov hears that his brother Esav is coming toward him with 400 men, and he's overtaken by fear. And the Torah says, Vayachatz es ha'am asher ito. He divided his people who were with him into two camps. Rashi says that one camp will be the remnant in case the other one is attacked and, God forbid, destroyed. Says Reb David, we ourselves are similarly divided into two camps. We each have power and potential that's external, and we also have koyach pnimi, internal power. This inner reserve stays true and steadfast and does not suffer from the winds of fate or fortune. He quotes again the Chidushei Harim, who says that this inner core is invincible, invulnerable, cannot be attacked by any adversary. And he emphasizes that this essence is present in every single Jew. That's how the sages can say that a Jew who sins is nevertheless a Jew. Afal pi shechata Yisrael hu. And the Zohar explains that the 248 components of a person's body are called a camp, a machaneh. And the mitzvah from Parshas Kiseitze is that your camp shall be holy. V'hayu machanecha kodesh. Writes Reb David of Sachachav. This is the idea of Yaakov's dividing into two camps, because Am Yisrael really is a single person with revealed capabilities and hidden capabilities. That we have as a people the inner resolve and strength that no enemy can ever destroy or even harm. This is the inner meaning of yachatz, he says, in breaking the matzah in two. The first half is that part of us which is subject to our environment. We see that the Hebrew people were confused and dejected. They couldn't even listen to Moshe Rabbeinu because of kotzer ruach, shortness of breath, which also means shortness of spirit. They had no patience for it. They couldn't handle it. Being able to hear means being able to internalize the message, in this case of freedom. And he says they couldn't even do this because speech itself was in exile. That's the one half. The other half, the second half, is the inner, concealed part of our essence that remains invulnerable, remains eternally connected to its source, to Avinu Shabashamayim, no matter what the situation. And in this we start to see the upside, even the necessity of brokenness. Here's how Rav Rimon from Gush expresses it quite beautifully. Quote, he says, quote, "The moment of crisis, of rupture, things fall apart, all seems broken and beyond repair. Yet our faith lives on, the faith that destruction will eventually lead to progress and renewal. Sometimes things must be broken in order that they may be rebuilt. In the darkest of times, we must recall the greater process at hand. Already at Yachatz, we await Afikomen. At the moment of crisis, as the bread of affliction is broken in two, we recognize this rupture as a stage in the redemption process, and we anticipate eating the matzah of freedom." End of quote. In other words, back to the point of our beginning, there is nothing so whole as a broken heart, in the words of the Kotzker. As we acknowledge and embrace and even celebrate the brokenness of Yachatz, we are already on our way to redemption. In her Haggadah titled Seder Talk, Dr. Erica Brown quotes none other than the late, great Leonard Cohen, who may even have been thinking of Yachatz when he wrote in Anthem, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." A good Shabbos, Chag Kosher V'Sameach.